Massive concentrations of additional artillery, heavy mortars, and naval fire, a battleship or cruiser provided gunfire support for each American Army regiment, reduced even some American troops to stupefaction or numbness, as one put it, before they advanced into the wreckage of Earth, where the explosives had landed. Just like Americans, Japanese were consumed with the frustration of being unable to do anything against the firing from long range. A private in Kojo's battalion would remember, "No dead angle or safe place anywhere. Bombs and shells came from land, from the sea, from the sky. If you were in a valley, trench mortars did the job. One step out of your cave and your fate was in God's hands." Another put it more directly. It's sheer wonder that any foot soldiers managed to live. The supremely professional Kojo was less concerned. "So this is real combat," he said to himself. "Very costly." But he didn't react to the cost, and his non-commissioned officers never dreamed of complaining. Reckoning the time must soon come for the bayonet charge for which the battalion had practiced so long and ardently, he anticipated his chance to make the Americans panic, as his predecessors had done to the Chinese in the Sino-Japanese War. What did such practice have to do with this war? What good were bayonets against flame-throwing tanks? But he'd ask himself that only after the war, when he at last fully accepted that firepower, in which deluded Japan was pathetically inferior, was the critical determinant. Meanwhile, he kept his men on the forward slopes, where they could see, and be seen by, American observers. Almost a week passed, and nearly half his men were lost before he woke up, in his own phrase. Now he ordered his company commanders to keep only 1 or 2 men from each platoon in the forward slope's foxholes. All others were to remain under cover on the rear slope until the enemy's big guns let up and his infantry approached. Although Japanese forces had deployed similarly on other islands, Kojo was so unpracticed in defence that he considered himself something of an originator when he at last put his new tactics into practice. Days later, his force of nearly 1,000 had been reduced by about 2/3. But now casualties were much diminished. His new deployment worked well. His attackers were the 17th Infantry Regiment of the Army's veteran 7th Hourglass Division, which had been in some of the bitterest fighting in the south from the first week in April. They'd move out every morning after their breakfast, sometimes supported by tanks, including the new flame-throwing model that shot its napalm well into caves. Kojo's skeleton crew of spotters on the forward slope would relay their coordinates to those waiting on the rear one, and mortar crews would fire until the Americans pulled back. The same sequence was usually repeated in the afternoon, after which the defenders would take cover for the enemy's late afternoon artillery and naval bombardment. Kojo's strongest contribution to the surprisingly powerful defence was a novel use of the knee mortar, as it came to be known from its height. Early in the war, Americans erroneously thought it was braced against the leg or knee for firing, which may also account for the name. Because the very light, simple weapon could fire its 2-inch projectile almost straight up and down, it could be used at extremely close range and almost any angle. It was deadly just where American mortars, of which the smallest was almost twice the size, had to stop firing for fear of hitting their own troops. American infantrymen on Okinawa had already developed a hatred for Japanese mortars, which could be carried anywhere by a single man, fired from safe positions, and quickly moved to avoid retaliation once their location was spotted. Knee mortars, the clever little version that could drop their shells right on your head. That's how accurate they were, rated special loathing. Whenever we evacuated wounded over open ground, an American would remember, we ran like hell because they could almost pinpoint the stretcher. Each Japanese infantry platoon had a squad of 4 knee mortars, and there were 3 platoons in a company, 3 companies in Kojo's battalion. But instead of the usual deployment under the platoon leaders, he concentrated the 36 weapons into one unit under his personal command, producing what American military historians would call an exceptionally effective system of concentrating fire. Although some 24th Division artillery was still operational, Each firing revealed the gun's position, provoking far heavier return fire from American planes and rocket launchers, as well as the land and naval cannon. The guns were also virtually immobile in the caves into which they were pulled back after their scant few rounds, because the 32nd Army was unable to shift troops, let alone trucks, anywhere during daylight. By early May, the planes would pounce on a single soldier who moved, not to mention gun crews trying to take up new positions. That lack of support from other units made Kojo's knee mortars even more important to him. His machine guns, easily concealed and fired from very low to the ground, were also highly effective. Day after day, 10 or 15-second bursts from his dozen skillfully deployed guns cut down lead Americans, after which the main body of the advance generally retreated. Unless American tanks joined the push, the defenders sometimes achieved brief equality in equipment in such encounters, because the attackers had only the armament they could carry, and heavy artillery support had to cease for fear of causing own-fire casualties. Americans had been repeatedly assured they were superior to the enemy in every way, able to lick them hands down when it comes to the fighting, as their pre-invasion briefing assured them. But it wasn't nearly so easy when it came closer to a fair fight of man against almost equally armed man. Kojo's men learned to rush to the surface and prepare for those close encounters the instant bombardments let up. On May 3rd, the battalion helped shred a major assault on the ridge. The captain reckoned he could check the advance of an entire battalion if just 2 or 3 machine guns remained operable, for the Americans seemed attached to fighting by the clock, and with great caution and concern for their lives. It was, he thought, as if they were engaged in some gigantic industrial operation instead of mounting the all-out, go-for-broke attack that would have won them quick victory. What a gift to his tactics! Lower-ranking Japanese shared his puzzlement over American prudence. A soldier at the eastern anchor of the same line, also under siege by an army unit, observed that Americans never made surprise attacks. First of all, they provide a protected zone, construct roads, put up a bridge if it's down, level a wide area for parking their vehicles, which are loaded with weapons and supplies. Once that solid base of operations is established, they start advancing one step at a time, in what an American military historian would compare to the movement of the tireless inchworm. Such creeping advances usually pertained more to army than to marine tactics, but not on the Shuri line in May. Still, the advance is like a mountain moving slowly at you. Against that, our resistance is like a child playing with a little firecracker, so we have to retreat. Kojo, however, was unimpressed with anything American apart from the lavish materiel. He speculated that any Japanese unit on the offensive there would have gone for the jugular, whatever the casualties. The perceived American unwillingness to sacrifice lives also surprised his men. Many Japanese elsewhere on Okinawa were taken by American bravery, of pilots who dived through anti-aircraft barrages, for example, and silently noted the falseness of their teaching about their enemy's softness and weakness. At Kochi, however, even Kojo's privates considered them too cautious. At the same time, they were envious that the only time Americans did seem to take risks was to recover their dead and wounded. They themselves were so short of supplies that they were forced to look at corpses, their own as well as American, as sources of useful items, from weapons to rations. Apart from the few forward observers, the men lived in their unimproved caves during daylight. 2 miles southwest, the 1,000 occupants of the less crowded and incomparably better equipped 32nd Army headquarters under Shuri Castle lived like a higher species of underground animal. Night barely differed from day in the deep, dank tunnel, with its warren of companionways and smell of disinfectant from the medical centre. The air was foul. The lights were permanently on. Disorientation was inevitable. Half-naked off-watch soldiers snored in shared berths or on mouldy bales of rice. Underground water soaked the lowest berths, but some who shared them liked the relief from the stifling heat. Even Colonel Yahara, Ushijima's gifted operations officer who had planned the defense from underground, began to feel he was being dragged to the bottom of hell. But everyone derived some strength from the lantern-lit slogans on the walls. "Be a shield to your emperor. Don't die until you annihilate your foes. Stick to your guns until you die." Kojo's troops were doing the latter from suffocating caves that made all those behind the lines luxurious by comparison. They reeked of smoke, gunpowder, and the human odours of men long unwashed and under supreme stress. The purgatory's final physical and psychological touches were scores of moaning, severely wounded men inside and hundreds of corpses just outside. But the living soldiered on with little surprise. Surrender was never considered. Even if they could somehow arrange to meet Americans for that, it would only bring a more hideous death, most Japanese remaining convinced that the enemy yearned to kill them in monstrous ways. Some believed bestial Marines, whose special purpose in Asia was to rape and murder Asian women, had qualified for the corps by murdering their parents. The demons and beasts got their laughs castrating prisoners, and if Japan lost the war, Americans would torture, mutilate, and drastically depopulate the homeland. Even the 1 in 1,000 who disapproved of Japanese militarism knew prisoner of war was an abominable phrase. As one such rare exception put it, dishonour that would make him afraid to face friends and relatives, if he'd ever have that chance, given that he might be taken to America for a life of hard labour. A few bold thinkers speculated that surrender's shame might be lessened if Japan lost the war, in which case the emperor too would become a prisoner. But 99% remained convinced that surrender would hasten the rape of everything sacred by barbarians who hated beautiful Japan. Such a life would not be worth living. Captain Kojo's stoic men had been conditioned, since at least their first years in school, to obey authority without question, to suffer any amount of hardship in necessary silence, and to believe that a display of will would overcome all obstacles in the end. Many were natives of the northernmost main island of Hokkaido, whose inhabitants were considered slow to learn but extremely tenacious. Kojo supposed they were glad to be fulfilling their duty, even knowing it would end in death. Few shared their elite commander's belief in their happiness, but most were proud that their knee mortars were exacting such a toll on the enemy. Even fewer cried, "Long live the Emperor!" when hit, but most were convinced that the bravest possible stand on Okinawa, with the greatest damage to the Americans, might prevent an invasion of the mainland, where their families would be at the evil enemy's mercy. And since Tokyo surely knew better than anyone that the loss of Okinawa would open the way to that nightmare, they continued bolstering themselves with talk of the massive reinforcements on their way to relieve them and/or help launch the long-awaited counterattack. The 9th Division was returning from Formosa for a landing in the far south. The combined fleet was steaming from Singapore or waiting to pounce from one of the Ryukyu Islands farther north. New secret weapons were about to be introduced. The Americans' supply lines were fatally overextended, and they were running desperately low on men and arms. Washington was poised to sign an armistice on terms favourable to Japan, and so on. Very few soldiers suspected Okinawa had already been written off as a sacrifice to gain time for the decisive battle in the homeland. Those illusions accompanied a refusal to accept that the battle elsewhere on Okinawa wasn't going well. Even more than when Yamato was sunk, no bad news was believed unless accompanied by direct proof. Circumstances enhanced the Japanese capacity to believe in the nation's divine invincibility. The great majority of civilians, raised on their isolated islands with deep mental barriers to the outside world, honestly and genuinely accepted their leaders' bizarre accounts of the war's progress. With even less information and more urgent need to trust, the 32nd Army had reason to deny the evidence of their eyes. Of course, some troops merely followed orders without much patriotism until their time came to die. Of course, there were doubts at the bottom of many hearts. But to air them would have invited certain trouble. A soldier of another unit would remember of that period. So we all talked bravely. Looking back at that time now, it was as if we were on death row, talking about a possible reprieve. The hugely unfair American advantage in numbers and equipment reinforced the sense of mission. Hadn't Japan always been treated unfairly after all? Always been threatened since the arrival of Perry's black ships? Hadn't her need to expand been fired by foreigners' oppression? It also stiffened the conviction that Yamato Damashi would be decisive in the end, which was as deep as the 10th Army's conviction of the superiority of the American way of life. That didn't free Kōjō's men from a quaking fear of death or stifle their constant hope that their turn would come tomorrow rather than today. But much more than Americans, they were prepared not to return from Okinawa. Their endurance at Kochi and elsewhere was also bolstered by a desire to serve a better cause than individual advancement. With Fortress Okinawa seen as not only the home island's best protection from invasion, but also essential to Japan's survival, this most important stand of the war, as Ivan Morris would call it in The Nobility of Failure, tragic heroes in the history of Japan, became virtually synonymous with kamikaze. Virtually everyone felt he should indeed be willing to die for the emperor without regret. Their emotions, though not easily expressed, ran deep. In fact, their tendency to act on emotion rather than on reason helped condition them to accept the idea of extreme sacrifice. On top of that came the group pressure to do one's duty. Every American training officer knew men were able to function in battle because they feared failure in their comrades' eyes more than they feared death. That was even more true of the Japanese, whose dread of ignominy had long played a greater role in society, and to whom subservience of individual interests to group discipline was far more natural. An American battalion, too, might fight to its last man's death, if its members felt their family's existence depended on it, but alternatives would surely be discussed, including surrender in order to fight another day. However, even the least fervent among Kōjō's men accepted that this life had to end before a better one could begin. A soldier who was later amazed that he'd survived summed up the mood. "I never thought I'd come home alive. It was clear to us all what would happen, but we could do nothing else." The American offensive of May 11th to crack the Shuri line was still a week away, but 10th Army headquarters already accepted that a major undertaking was needed to break the back of the defense that was so much stronger than anticipated. In particular, the Americans' appreciation of the skills of the Jap fanatics at Kochi Ridge increased. Kōjō's concentration of accurate fire was too serious a menace to try to overcome in one attack. The policy of steady destruction with superior firepower would be maintained, but the Japanese showed no signs of being destroyed, despite pressure on the 7th Division to do that from the Army Corps' headquarters. In the second week of May, the utterly exhausted 7th was replaced by the 96th, reinforced and fresh from a 10-day rest. The new troops continued probing mornings and afternoons, and Kōjō's mortars, now used only when the attackers were fully exposed, continued cutting them down. Tank-supported American penetration proceeded on both flanks of Kochi Ridge, but the 1st Battalion held on, now inflicting more casualties than it was taking. It was the kind of defence by attrition Colonel Yahara had dreamed of, with Japanese tactics and tenacity almost a match for American equipment and might. The enemy would pound the position much of the day, shaking the earth and threatening to collapse Kōjō's little headquarters cave. But however miserable that made the recipients, most were protected and ready to move out the moment the bombardment stopped for the small arms skirmishes in which they stood a chance, because the Americans couldn't make use of their roughly 50-to-1 advantage, including naval and air support, in firepower. The 1st Battalion was reinforced by an understrength rifle company commanded by a Captain Kiguchi, a friend of Kōjō's from the Imperial Academy and service in Manchuria. Kiguchi, a typical academy graduate devoted wholly to military life and thoughts, was exceptionally eager, cool, and brave. Despite his pleas to join the fighting, however, Kōjō insisted the slightly junior officer was his guest, and kept his 180-odd men in reserve, until a week's attrition of the battalion left him little choice. exuberant Kiguchi utterly ignored all danger, dashing to his machine gun positions and occasionally to confer with Kojo. His requests for permission to blow up American tanks with satchel charges were so insistent that Kojo reluctantly succumbed, even knowing how badly a commander's loss damaged unit morale. Kiguchi succeeded in blowing up one tank, but a close escape on a second attempt prompted Kojo to withdraw permission. As for Kojo's men, massive fatigue as well as the reduced but regular daily casualties were weakening them. When the enemy's evening shelling ceased, they dragged themselves to complete tasks that could be undertaken only in the relative safety of darkness, repairing their trenches, carrying their wounded to an underground first aid station, and supplying themselves. The work details would continue until the resumption of the shelling at dawn. All were incessantly thirsty. There was so little water that they had trouble swallowing the biscuit that supplemented their rations, and some risked leaving their positions in daylight to sneak to wells below the ridge. Otherwise, they carried in water at night from supply caves in the Naha area, 2 or 3 miles south. The handful who were to survive would fully appreciate the quantity of American supplies and equipment, and therefore the hopelessness of their cause, only after seeing stocks of them near their POW camps. But even now, it seemed to the battalion's remaining fighters that the enemy had limitless supplies of ammunition, while they were restricted to 4 or 5 rounds a day from each mortar. After a particularly successful engagement, a warrant officer happily reported the results to Kojo. "Yes, but you expended more rounds than necessary," the captain reproved. A handful of Japanese ships had risked sailing to Okinawa after the 10-10 air raid, but none arrived with either replacement soldiers or material after L-Day, and the trickle delivered by air stopped after the first week of April. Kojo worried about running out of ammunition during an enemy attack. Like the drinking water, each shell had to be brought in on the men's backs at night. They also carried in their food, reduced to hardtack and a single daily rice ball about the size of a fist, with a sour, salty pickle inside. Few were any hungrier than combat Americans, despite weeks of fighting all day and working much of the night under extreme duress. Still, they burned so much energy with so little replacement that all became severely weakened on top of their exhaustion. With no rest and, unlike the Americans, no replacements, the undernourished soldiers grew so tired that some began sleeping straight through the bombardments. Back at 32nd Army headquarters, senior officers' distress over the erosion of the force's strength mixed with worry that limiting it exclusively to defense was undermining morale. Colonel Yahara, still the consummate realist by Japanese standards, tried to stiffen spirits by emphasizing how much strength had been preserved even after a month of severe fighting. No Japanese force on any other island had held out so long. But few found comfort in such negative logic. Staff officers grew increasingly impatient to be Japanese by striking back. Many privates at the front also yearned for something, anything, that promised relief from their wretched existence in caves, where they were on the verge of losing our sanity from suffering inside, as a typical dweller described it. The battle's American rich and Japanese poor differed in more than equipment and supplies. The former were mobile, the latter's fetid refuges, which would protect them only until they died there, also kept planning officers from seeing the enemy's moves. When reports were delivered to them after dark, by foot because so few lines of communication remained operable, it was too late to react to battlefield changes, even if the available Japanese forces had been mobile. Thus a soldier's complaint that "we donned a new kind of armour and called it a cave, which bound us hand and foot." The image of an offensive was better than the underground reality of filth, suffocating stench, and the dizziness of oxygen deprivation. One soldier noticed that those imprisoned in his miserable cave had begun wishing agonizingly for a decisive sortie. Another was quite pleased to leave his stinking, soot-filled cave for what would probably be his end. While the fierce Japanese defense was confounding Americans, Japanese soldiers were more confounded by the failure of their air force and navy to appear. The approach of the emperor's birthday, first among national holidays, swelled hope like a rising tide. Thousands of caves lived on thoughts of April 29's promised issue of sweet potato brandy, which most wouldn't get, and of the giant swarm of friendly planes that would appear that morning after having cleverly bided their time. Then reinforcements would arrive to end the merciless hurricane of American fire and start the crushing of the brazen enemy. Sweet revenge! A medical corpsman drew strength from visions of the Jubilee's mass of planes that would signal the gigantic counterattack for turning the tide of the war at one huge blow. Kojo's surviving soldiers, accustomed to living by starlight, used that morning's pre-dawn hours for their usual brief break before the American bombardment began. They ate their cold, mouldy rice balls and assured themselves the combined fleet was on its way. Although the decimated Imperial Navy had no such plans, a tense staff meeting was taking place in the headquarters tunnel deep below Shuri Castle. The advocates of switching to offence had grown disgusted and bold enough for Colonel Yahara to complain that his life had been threatened by some of the fire-eaters. Predictably, the most fervent deprecation of defence and acclaim for attack came from Lieutenant General Isamu Cho, Ushijima's fiery chief of staff. Rumour had it that the ultra-nationalist planner of assassinations and unauthorised military forays during the 1930s pleaded with Yahara to accept the need for an offensive. "You have your own ideas, of course, but I beg you, please die with me." Cho's hot tears in the tunnel corridor were said to have wet Yahara's hands and melted his cool reasoning. If that exchange indeed took place, the two nevertheless clashed sharply at the staff meeting on the Emperor's birthday. The struggle between Cho's passion for action, or romantic self-sacrifice, and Yahara's commitment to rational economy of force, or dreary submission to crushing reality, was again out in the open. 4 weeks earlier, 2 days after L-Day, Cho had urged a massive charge against the newly landed and still disorganized enemy, but Ushijima disapproved. Then came the secret signal informing of Yamato's imminent sortie, which included instructions to take advantage of it by counter-attacking on the ground, starting April 7th, when the great ship was scheduled to arrive off the coast. Cho exulted. The attack and more attack that had created the Empire would now save it by smashing the confused Americans. However, Ushijima believed the first week of the battle was still too early for counterattacks and telegraphed Tokyo with his advice to stop the naval operation. Combined Fleet Headquarters seemed to be living in a dream world, ignorant of the enemy's immense strength at sea and in the air. A very modest counterattack was made on April 12th, after which emotion swung toward Cho's stance. Now, on April 29th, he remained convinced that Japanese resolve could negate the American material advantages, just as Yahara still believed premature preoccupation with honourable death was self-indulgent. Cho's basic idea was to create battlefield chaos in order to engage the enemy in the hand-to-hand combat at which the Japanese excelled. He argued eloquently and persuasively that if things kept going as they were, the 32nd Army would soon lose its offensive capacity, then its ability to resist at all. The only hope was to snatch life from the midst of death by taking action while the means still existed. Mutual annihilation was better than the steady attrition that could end only in certain defeat. Annihilation was inevitable either way, Yahara countered, but an ill-conceived counterattack would hasten it. An attacking force usually needed a 3-to-1 advantage for success in modern battle. Charging a superior force with an inferior one was reckless rather than merely extremely risky. The losses, inevitably greater if the troops forfeited the advantages of their rear slope positions, would mean failure in the 32nd Army's primary duty of prolonging the battle as much as possible to give the mainland more time to prepare for its invasion. But a chorus of angry patriots who craved action at any cost all but shouted down Yahara's appeal. Reluctantly approving the staff consensus, the ordinarily amiable Ushijima ordered his chief operations officer to stop arguing in a way that would undermine unity and morale. He scheduled a massive counterattack for May 4th. The following day, Emperor Hirohito, who'd been urging his advisors from the beginning to press for something similar, radioed a message from Tokyo. "We really want this attack to succeed." 5 days of intense planning and preparations followed. Kojo's 24th Division would be the main attacking force, the 62nd having been too weakened to participate. A tank regiment and infantry battalion were moved up from reserve and committed for the first time. The spearhead would be in sight of Kojo's position, although other units would make the initial breakthrough. The final objectives were a full 5 miles north, halfway to the landing beaches, where the first main defensive line, including Kakazu Ridge, would be restored. The men of the 24th Division were ordered to kill at least 1 American devil for every Japanese. An extremely optimistic goal, since their losses had been roughly 10-1 until now, even with their underground protection. But the mood was exuberant. Attack at last. Victory. Honour. The 5th Floating Chrysanthemum was launched to coordinate with the counterattack. On May 3rd and 4, kamikazes sank a destroyer and put 17 other American ships out of action. On land, the Japanese softening up took place during the night of May 3rd and 4. A small banquet, served by attractively dressed typists and clerks, was still in progress in the headquarters tunnel when the big guns began firing, at 4:50 hours. As dawn approached, they delivered the most powerful Japanese barrage in the Pacific War so far, half an hour of all-out bombardment, as opposed to firing a precious few rounds, then pulling back into hiding. Those first full salvos in the 34 days of fighting were a grim surprise to the Americans. Captain Kojo could not know that, apart from cases of battle fatigue, the barrage caused relatively few casualties because most Americans were dug in deep and dry. But he and his men rejoiced in the flash and thunder of the Japanese artillery, especially after its failure to support his fighting until then. Cho's argument that attack would greatly boost morale seemed proved. In Kojo's 22nd Regiment, only the remains of Captain Kiguchi's rifle company would join the initial strike. The other units were assigned to screen the vanguard of 2 attacking regiments with heavy fire and smoke, then leapfrog ahead of them. Although Kojo knew nothing of Yahara's opposition to the counterattack, his regimental commander had told him he'd be in no hurry to join the advance, and he later learned that Yahara, determined not to doom the command to premature destruction, had confidentially advised some sympathetic officers that not all units need participate. In fact, the debacle was as bad as he predicted, despite the initial American surprise. Almost 1,000 valuable men were lost without purpose when Japanese amphibious units were spotted approaching both coasts. Those who survived destruction in the water by American artillery were slaughtered on the beaches, far from their targets. Navigational errors brought some boats directly into the sights of American batteries, where troops shouting "Banzai" helped pinpoint the fire on themselves. On land, Japanese detachments courageously attacked through their own killing artillery fire, most meeting total failure. After small units on both sides moved closer to annihilation by the other's guns, Japanese weakness in numbers and logistics rapidly became decisive. Delayed by faulty transportation, 2 battalions of the 89th Infantry Regiment, a sister regiment of Kojo's 22nd, were caught in the open by American artillery, which cut down another 1,000-odd men in minutes. Quickly recovering from their surprise, American units used their immense firepower with devastating effect. The all-out offensive evaporated like a brief dream, a Japanese survivor would lament. When dawn arrived, our forces, which had taken advantage of darkness to penetrate enemy territory, were exposed on the surface, that is, not in a cave, and cut down by the typhoon of enemy fire from ships, planes, and howitzers. 2 nights later, a few bloody stragglers from an attacking platoon dragged themselves back to the cave of that survivor to report no gain whatever for the massive losses. All realized the huge expenditure of irreplaceable ammunition had also been for nothing, and miserable and gloomy days returned to the cave after its 48 hours of hope. Only one battalion managed to penetrate about a mile to the north. Part of a sister regiment of Kojo's 24th Division, it was commanded by Captain Koichi Ito, who was also 24 years old and involved in his first combat after taking command of his battalion in Manchuria. At the Imperial Military Academy, Ito had been an even brighter exemplar of regular army officer resolve than his classmate Kojo. Since arriving on Okinawa, he'd received a total of 1 letter and hadn't concerned himself about how many arrived or didn't arrive for his men. That 1 letter was from his father, a former naval officer who happened to be friendly with a high-ranking strategist fired for refusing to help plan the war against America. If you start a war without first equipping the Air Force to match other leading nations, the strategist had warned, Japan will be in ashes and you will hurtle to hell. But if that rare acquaintance with dissenting views gave Ito an unusual perspective on the war, it didn't weaken his commitment. Before the American landing, he rode his battalion relentlessly and won the highest commendations for digging fortifications, then refused to be sent home on the eve of L-Day despite a severe case of dysentery. Ito's battalion was situated a few hundred yards west and behind Kojo's on Kochi Ridge. Jumping off from there, he alone managed to advance as planned and survive the first day with most of his force intact. The Iron Captain attacked again at midnight, firing a flare at a hill mass called Tanabaru Escarpment, from which Japanese units had been driven almost 2 weeks before, to show he'd reached his first major objective. But he was so surrounded by enemy guns that he had to keep all heads below ground and communicate with his officers by tossing messages tied to rocks into their foxholes. Just over a third of his 600 men, down from 1,000 before May 4th, were alive when he extricated himself, with supreme bravery and skill against overwhelming firepower, on May 7th. During the previous days, the success of his haggard force, with its severely limited armament and support, no tanks, rocket launchers, flamethrowers, suggests what might have been achieved with greater supplies and even partial air support. But Ito was the exception that proved the rule. The counterattack was acknowledged as having collapsed even before his second sally that midnight. On the evening of May 5th, the 32nd Army announced it would temporarily suspend the attack, claiming that it had inflicted sufficient damage. If the wording saved face for Cho and the staff officers, Ushijima couldn't undo the consequences of his second major strategic mistake, after letting Keramaretto and the airfields at Yomitan and Kadena fall with almost no opposition. The loss of nearly 7,000 of his best troops was catastrophic. The 24th Division had been disastrously weakened. Japanese artillery was decimated. The exposure of the previously hidden ordnance enabled American forces to pinpoint and destroy 19 heavy guns on the first day alone. And American casualties, heavy as they were by their own measures, barely exceeded those of the hard days of storming Japanese defensive positions. Instead of the prescribed kill ratio of 10-1, the Japanese lost up to 20 for every American. Even Cho now accepted that the 32nd Army could no longer think of offence. When they heard of the decision to abandon the counterattack, angry young members of the staff demanded an explanation. Unapologetic Cho did what he could to stem their tearful despair, and Ushijimi is said to have summoned Yahara for his own lachrymose promise to be guided by his advice in the future. Staff officers of course carried on, but a pall of gloom settled on them, as a scholar described the effect of the May 4 failure, and it never lifted. The expenditure of so many Japanese shells reduced each gun's daily allowance from 50 to 15. That, and the loss of many pieces, lessened total Japanese artillery firepower by about half. The depletion of infantry forces required more service and support units to be thrown into the weakening Shuri line. By American standards, the 24th Division, down to 3/5 of its original strength, was no longer a proper fighting unit. Although the 2 days of hopeless gesture hadn't increased casualties in Kojo's 1st Battalion, he now had to face heavier enemy pressure without Kiguchi's help. The junior captain's company was among the units either destroyed to the last man or left with wounded who couldn't make their way back to their lines. Kojo later learned that enemy tanks had massacred most of the men hours after their advance down from Kochi Ridge. The American units there regrouped and resupplied fast enough to resume their offensive on May 6th, 2 days before VE Day. Adding gasoline and napalm to their ordnance, they tried to throw 10-gallon cans over the hill to burn out Kojo's men, who, however, mustered enough fire the following day to force the retreat of 2 American infantry platoons that had taken part of a small adjoining hill. A cascading rain also helped. Hard as it was on the Japanese, it caused more disruption to the attackers by miring their heavy equipment in impenetrable mud. Kojo's men were now the backbone of what a study by US Army historians would call the chief obstacle to the 7th Division's advance. It demonstrated, the American account would explain, that the defences at Kochi Ridge could not be overrun in a single attack, but required a tedious, methodical destruction of individual enemy soldiers and positions. So the 1st Battalion's casualties relentlessly mounted. The man who reported the names of his friends who had been killed one day would be among the names reported the following one, a soldier from a similarly besieged unit would recall. 1 by 1, 2 by 2, Kojo's troops dwindled. His unit seemed to be going from a battalion to a company to a platoon. There were now too few men to continue evacuating the gravely wounded to the regimental tunnel south of Naha, where the medical facility remained. Most treatment was limited to stopping hemorrhages. Ambulatory wounded were given first aid and returned to their posts immediately. The chief medical officer was ordered to join the fighters with all his patients from the tunnel, some 200 men, who were strong enough to hold a rifle. The opposite traffic back to the tunnel was more pathetic. Some of the gravely wounded tried to crawl there, like night worms, as one saw them. Others preferred to die where their fallen comrades lay. Although saddened by his inability to help them, Kojo took their great bravery as normal and even envied the lucky who had departed. They'd won honour and an end to suffering, whereas the living had to keep going until the only relief would come for them too. The captain's long training for sacrifice enabled him to accept the losses with slight concern. Sustained by Gaman, the exceptional Japanese patience and perseverance in the face of adversity, and by their regiment's venerable record of valour in combat on top of it, the men from whom he continued to stand apart also accepted their lot without complaint. Kojo would later speculate that their enormous endurance and sacrifice for the nation was almost a natural culmination of their lives of severe deprivation for protracted periods. Only one company commander suffered a kind of shell shock. When his casualties reached 90%, that reserve lieutenant requested permission to return to the regimental tunnel to hunt for reinforcements. A fierce shout from Kojo interrupted his subordinate's very rare impertinence. "No! You will stay where you are!" Otherwise, he saw no cases of mental breakdown, which he wouldn't have understood anyway. Such weakness wasn't permitted, which probably helped prevent it. But the men had normal feelings. Okinawa's May is like southern Georgia's. When the rain let up, temperatures soared in the airless little caves. Day-long confinement there, with the extreme shortage of clean water, would have been torture enough, even without the smell of blood and sweat that mixed with the putrid stench of the wounds to suffocate us, in the words of Private Yoshio Kobayashi, who served in a communications unit. Kobayashi's duties gave him more relief than most from confinement in his inferno-like cave, but only at the price of more exposure to danger. Delivering a message weeks before, he and a fellow communications soldier had had to cross a beach bare of all cover. They clung to a telephone pole for futile protection, while a Grumman made 4 or 5 strafing runs at them, then ran desperately and collapsed inside a deserted cave. Laden with a heavy radio in addition to their rifles and packs, they set out again after sundown. Hands numb, drenched in sweat, They crossed streams in total darkness because bridges were demolished and kept taking cover because shells and bombs fell on them as if by signal whenever they risked using a main road. After more hiding the following day, they resumed their mission in the drizzly of dusk until a sergeant they met in the smoke of a recently levelled village told them their destination was already being overrun by Americans. But to their delight, since most Japanese units had little knowledge about or interest in others, he gave them directions to their company, which had moved in their absence. Setting out again for there, they soon completed their odyssey. Although some of Kojo's men sustained their black jokes even now, the captain himself was far from anything even faintly humorous. Under fire, he was even more strict than in Manchuria, and so remote that the lower ranks, to whom he still rarely talked, hardly considered him a fellow sufferer. His higher non-commissioned officers admired his sterling military qualities and bearing more than ever. The young captain kept his figure as straight and neat as possible in the circumstances, and was so committed to fighting to the utmost that he seemed devoid of all personality. The men had called the major who'd replaced him when he was injured the old man, but they had no nickname for this ramrod who cared only about doing his duty, defending his honour. As the enemy's regular morning and afternoon attacks intensified, Kojo's men grew so weak that he was surprised the enemy didn't mount a major attack. Kochi Ridge now represented a significant bulge on the map, all territory on both flanks having been taken. But Kojo's line was as thin as a thread. The May 4 counter-offensive's shearing of the 32nd Army's edge had put the men in a kind of shock, deepening the numbness caused by the relentless strain on their undernourished minds, bodies, and nerves. It in no way detracts from American triumphs over their horrendous hardships to acknowledge that Japanese soldiers endured far worse with more fortitude and many fewer breakdowns. They lived in the same mud, even thicker with blood. They were more infested with vermin, more debilitated by disease, more overrun by maggots feasting on their beloved comrades' rotting corpses. Their rations were not to be compared, and the number of incoming shells exceeded the number they fired at Americans by at least 50 times. If American Army analysts of the Okinawa fighting would ultimately conclude that troops should remain in the line no longer than 2 weeks because physical and mental fatigue from the need for constant alertness and strain of continuous shell fire greatly reduces the soldiers' efficiency, what of the Japanese soldiers in May? Brave to begin with, Kojos were long past fear, except when they saw small arms about to shoot them. They kept to their duties despite gruesome killings and maimings by mortar barrages that seemed to approach machine gun fire in intensity. Yet their physical condition after the weeks of fighting on empty stomachs and with only catnaps worried Kojo more than the drastically inadequate supply of ammunition, which still had to be carried on foot from 2 or 3 miles south. At dusk, he left his cave with several young officers to inspect his remaining forces. Twice mortar rounds killed all others in his little group. Miraculously unhit and unhurt, he now allowed the shared pressure of the day and night ordeal to slightly narrow his distance from his men. But the Japanese army inculcated self-sufficiency in its battalion commanders. His discussions with regimental commander Yoshida, still on a hill about a mile behind his, were therefore limited to 2 or 3 throughout this period. Nor did they have the American command's give and take between superiors and subordinates. Kojo reported his situation to Yoshida, but never requested help. Superiors were assumed to know who needed reinforcements and when, and the captain maintained his composure in the face of difficulty, the clearest mark of the academy graduate. He did not have to remember his responsibility to present an image of unshakable confidence, because he still felt calm and had no idea his resistance was among the most stubborn in the entire campaign. This was war. Emotion had no place in it. His duty was to fight serenely to the end. 30 years later, the Marine corporal named James Day, who'd become Commander-in-Chief of U.S. forces on Okinawa, would pay tribute to the remarkable enemy. To have fought so well with no air cover, no naval support, and virtually no support whatever required enormous resilience and skill. At the time, however, the American command felt no admiration for that, only frustration. Much of the mighty 10th Army remained stalled, despite the counter-offensive's weakening of the Shuri line. On the evening of May 10th, the day after Paul Dunfrey led his scouting party across the Asakawa, roughly 4 miles west of Kochi Ridge, Kojo was ordered to pull back about 800 yards to 3 small hills slightly south of his previous position. The 22nd Regiment's other 2 battalions had returned from their detached duty to the command of Colonel Yoshida, each with some 100 survivors. Together with Kojo's men, including a dozen from his headquarters company, the entire regiment, once numbering some 3,300 men, consisted of roughly 300 combat troops nearing the limit of fatigue. Kojo's were so spent that the regimental commander reinforced them with fresh men paired from the regimental colour guard. That decision spoke for itself about the battalion's condition, since capture of the regiment's colours, which had been presented by the Emperor himself, would be the supreme disgrace. But it bolstered fighting strength to that of approximately 2 healthy platoons. Kojo deployed them on the new rear slopes. With Shuri only a few thousand yards behind him, his orders to hold his position to the last man were superfluous. Some of his toughest non-coms, including a few veterans of the China War, continued repulsing the advances of the enemy, who tried hard on May 11th, the day General Buckner launched his general offensive, then seemed to lose energy after his weeks of attacks. Kojo believed he could have held the new hills for weeks with rested men and adequate supplies, but both had dwindled to near nothing. 30 men were too few to fire the mortars or to carry their shells. The first company consisted only of its commander, a replacement lieutenant. The second company, commanded by a sergeant, had half a dozen men, the third company 10. All moved in a permanent stupor. When enemy tanks started up to surround Kojo's position, he and the chief medical officer, the lieutenant who'd been ordered from the regimental tunnel to the front, discussed suicide. Then the rain turned so violent that the tanks pulled back. The end came on May 16th, while the Marines were having one of their worst days on Sugarloaf, 4 miles southwest. A nearby hill defended by another unit fell, giving the Americans a clear, short line of fire on Kojo's position. But his observers had succumbed to exhaustion and slept. Blowing them apart with hand grenades at close range, the Americans gave the men slightly to the rear their first touch of panic. Surprised, too, Kojo ran through the smoke of the enemy's phosphorus grenades into a well-maintained cave in the largest of the hills behind him. A handful of his men ran with him. The rest were dead. Several dozen badly wounded men were already there, moaning in the dark. Kojo whispered an order for silence. Despite the American shouts overhead, he hoped absolute quiet inside might allow them to go undetected until they could sneak out at nightfall. But a first lieutenant who'd run in with him, 1st Company's replacement commander, had no stomach for more. "This is hopeless," he whispered. "I'm going to die here." Kojo, too, suddenly lost heart. The cave's original users were artillery spotters who had cut a hatch in its top and built a ladder for access. The Americans shouting from there grew more excited. Kojo knew there was no escape from the hand grenades or satchel charges they were readying to toss down the hatch. Surrender never entered his thoughts. There was only one way out. He felt no pain or panic, not even disappointment or nervousness. His training or exhaustion kept him utterly calm, although he'd have liked to let his wife and family know how and where he died. "I've done my duty," he thought with satisfaction. "I fought with honour and fulfilled my life's purpose. Now it's the end." He put his pistol to his temple and enjoyed a vision of beautiful Emiko during their happy trip to Manchuria. As he curled his finger around the trigger, something hurtled down the hatch. The explosion of a satchel charge, devastating in the confined space, tore the pistol from his hand. Kojo did not think of trying again when he regained consciousness. After his last instant reprieve, some counterforce made him prefer to resume fighting until someone killed him, which would be soon enough. Badly shaken, but apparently otherwise unhurt, he couldn't find his pistol in the pitch dark. The sound of American voices, still overhead, warned him not to try to leave until after they did. Groping for fellow survivors, he found two: the despairing first lieutenant and a courageous senior private who'd fought the entire campaign. Kojo's pep talk to the lieutenant was in vain. The reserve officer remained determined to die where he was, but the private was eager to fight again. The explosion or subsequent shell fire had sealed the mouth of the cave. Hours after the American voices stopped, Kojo and the private began digging with their hands. Finally, 1st Battalion's 2 known survivors crawled out and into the night's silence. They wriggled like worms into the shell holes that pockmarked the hill until an enemy sentry spied them about 20 yards from the cave. His shots missed. After huddling in their hole for a time, they resumed their crawling down the slope of the hill, past American silhouettes and toward the new Japanese line. They found Colonel Yoshida's headquarters cave toward midnight. The regimental commander knew Kojo's position had been overrun because his young operations lieutenant had ignored the American shelling to check from another observation post. Now he seemed happy to see Kojo alive, although he'd known him less than 2 months. "I always put you in the most difficult positions," he said. "I had to, but I regret it nevertheless." He put out his hand. "You fought very well. You deserve our congratulations." Kojo fought back tears. Of course he must show no emotion. But now he knew, and was profoundly happy his regimental commander knew, that his position had held out longest on that front. 20. Ushijima abandons the Shuri line. Sugarloaf was taken 2 days after Kochi Ridge. Neighbouring barriers fell almost concurrently. The 6th Marines pressed onto Horseshoe Ridge behind Sugarloaf. The 1st Marines pushed up through slaughterous Wanadraw below Shuri itself, and the American Army divisions took Konnikal and Sugar Hills as well as the Wart Hill Flat Top Hill Chocolate Drop Triangle east of Shuri, where the defence network almost equalled that of the Sugarloaf Triangle to the west. May 11 to 21 could hardly have been more savage at every muddy knob and slope below those barriers. The 96th and 77th Army Divisions together reported 2,271 wounded and 402 killed and missing. The dead below Chocolate Drop struck one observer as a skirmish line lying down to rest. Most of the 60,000 Okinawan and Japanese deaths so far had come in and around the Shuri line. Fewer than 500 Japanese prisoners had been taken, many unconscious or too badly wounded to resist or kill themselves. There were even fewer prisoners the other way, partly because Americans were convinced, with good reason, that raised hands would court a quick death. Scores of wounded GIs and Marines played dead when enemy soldiers emerged after dark to strip bodies of wristwatches and rations. Those who lived to tell the tale endured kicks to their gaping wounds, fingers poked straight into their eyes, and booted jumps on their testicles. Almost all who failed such tests with a gasp or moan were finished with a bullet or bayonet. A few prisoners were treated as badly as in the American propaganda about all Japanese. 2 weeks after L-Day, 3 airmen parachuted onto Ishigaki Island, roughly halfway between Okinawa and Formosa, whose garrison had suffered casualties in an American air raid the previous day. 2 of the 3, beaten too badly to walk, were dragged to holes, where a Japanese captain, proud of his skill, acquired in China, neatly beheaded one. When a second executioner, having noisily boasted about being chosen, managed to cut through only half his victim's neck, sailors finished the job. The third man, whose unwillingness to answer questions during his interrogation condemned him to a less honourable end, was tied to a stake and used for bayonet practice. 2 other Americans were beheaded on Izina Island, some 15 miles north of Okinawa, and 3 shot to death on Aoshima, where Ernie Pyle was killed. No such cold-blooded atrocities would become known on Okinawa itself, perhaps because no American prisoners were reported taken at the Shuri line, where the dead died in combat. But despite their numbers, 10th Army staff members believed they could see the end after the critical 10 days that melted the core of the defense. Gleanings from interrogations of the few Japanese prisoners supported the assumption that Ushijima was making his final stand where he'd hurt them most. The Japanese also took it for granted that they'd remain in the rump of their Shuri bastion until the last man was killed by the enemy or by himself. Rumours circulated about a plan to pull in all functioning units from farther south for a last-ditch effort near the 32nd Army Headquarters tunnel. On May 22nd, however, the commander called another conference, this one to discuss new contingency plans with his senior staff and high officers of his fighting units. With no more than a third of his combat strength to defend little more of the line than Shuri itself, Ushijima knew the full difficulty of his position. Imperial General Headquarters had abandoned the pretense of supporting a decisive battle on Okinawa. A week earlier, while his land battleships ringing Shuri were still repulsing their attackers, the ordinarily laconic general had requested reinforcements, warning that the fall of the line would mean the end of his organised resistance. Tokyo's answer was a promise of commando-type raids. One was actually mounted 2 days later on Yomitan airfield, which had been taken on L-Day and now teemed with American planes. The Japanese allocated 12 obsolete bombers for the assault, each carrying a dozen paratroops from an elite unit that planned a suicidal attack with grenades and explosive charges. But mechanical trouble kept 4 of the planes on the ground, and when radar detected the others' approach, 7 of the remaining 8 were downed by American anti-aircraft batteries firing an almost solid crisscross. Riddled with shell fragments, the single surviving plane managed to belly land at Yomitan, where its crew leaped out together with the dozen commandos, demolition charges tied around their waists. Before being killed to the last man, they destroyed or damaged 27 planes and much aviation fuel and munitions. Happy news of the field's retaking went out to the soldiers of the 32nd Army. In fact, it was cleared of debris and put back in operation the following morning, and the Japanese made no further attempt to land troops on Okinawa, so close to their airfields in China, on Formosa, and on the mainland. Only the kamikaze raids continued. Like them, that first attempt to put a force on land confirmed to Americans that their enemy was incorrigibly fanatic. Pilot Samuel Hines was shocked by a raider blowing himself up with a grenade held to his belly. Hines reasoned the point of the May 24 raid was self-destruction rather than destruction. He was appalled by his own conclusion that the true end of the war for the men I was fighting against was not victory but death. All through the May 24 raid was coordinated with the 7th Floating Chrysanthemum. Ushijima now knew Imperial General Headquarters valued kamikaze operations more for delaying the inevitable invasion of the mainland than for trying to prevent the 32nd Army's certain defeat. Having had no illusions about winning since he lost the 9th Division, he now had none about reinforcements either. However, he did have options, which was why he called his key conference on the evening of May 22nd. He'd found a way to forestall the end. 2 evenings later, American spotter planes flew over Shuri Castle to help direct gunfire from several ships led by USS Mississippi. Her crew had no idea an earlier battleship of the same name had closed on the same target. The first was the sometime flagship of the squadron that opened Japan, astute, arrogant Matthew Calbraith. Perry stopped in Okinawa on his way there and back, and dictated severe terms to his utterly innocent, unwilling hosts. "Poor Okinawans," said appalled members of his party of that first American Okinawan encounter. An embarrassed clerk on the earlier Mississippi called the island a mouse in the talons of the eagle. She arrived in May 1853. The Commodore gave calculated insult to a welcoming party and announced to its leading official, a courtly elder with what struck one of Perry's men as the most dignified demeanour, that he intended to call on the castle. One American thought the Okinawan party looked grave enough to be going to an execution. With great courtesy and tact, they implored Perry not to make his call. Countering that he expected a reception worthy of his position, Perry gave orders that his men could go ashore wherever they pleased. On a date he chose for his self-invitation, a sedan chair he'd ordered made for himself bore the vain Commodore in his most impressive full-dress uniform along the lovely winding roads from the port to the castle. "I cannot conceive of a more beautiful pageant," he would write. The beauty included 2 field guns and 2 companies of Marines, whose presence finally forced unarmed Okinawans to open the symbolically important Gate of Courtesy at the entrance to the castle grounds. Some members of his party watched his gun-toting overbearance in dismay. It was a struggle between weakness and right, and power and wrong, for a more high-handed piece of aggression has not been committed by anyone. A lay missionary and Chinese linguist who served as his translator would write, managing to escape the censorship Perry tried to impose on reports from Okinawa, lest any contradict his own. "I was ashamed at having been a party to such a procedure, and pitied these poor defenceless islanders." So it went for the remainder of this visit, as well as most of a second one, when Perry returned after putting his demands to Japan. Grave American insults, including a rape by a sailor, widened the cultural misunderstandings. Officers sent ashore to secure housing forced open locked gates and took possession of what turned out to be a schoolhouse. When all attempts to repossess it failed, Okinawans brought fruits and vegetables for its squatters. Other commandeered buildings included a temple, and threats to occupy Shuri Castle itself were supported by manoeuvres on ship and shore to display the squadron's overwhelming weaponry. In a charitable moment, Perry called the Ryukyu Islands as pleasant as any in the world, and Okinawans industrious and inoffensive. But he, proud of interposing a little Yankee diplomacy against the natives, displayed immediate force at their every failure to show the deference he felt was due him and his country. The Commodore behaved throughout as if Okinawans were as duty-bound to obey as he was entitled to command. Setting out for Japan the second time, he left behind an armed party proclaiming he'd hold the Ryukyus under limited authority until he'd secured his objectives in Tokyo. In Perry's defence, it should be said that the same imperious resolve that abused the gentle islanders seemed necessary for his diplomatic assault on Japan. Commodore James Biddle, his predecessor in trying to negotiate with Tokyo 7 years earlier, and 16 years after Japanese had fired on an unarmed American merchant ship, had been repulsed, scornful Japanese interpreting his conciliatory approach as weakness. Perry waved his big stick on Okinawa partly to warn them America would not again be trifled with. Besides, he was acting in a time of expansionist sea power and self-assertion throughout the West. Okinawa happened to be one of the prizes in the European powers' competition for influence and empire in the carve-em-up colonialist age, in which the white man hailed himself as teacher. Perry's personal hauteur aside, he was up against old empires that were eager to claim all the rich prizes of trade, prestige, and domination for themselves. He might simply have taken a slice of Okinawa, as the British had taken Hong Kong from China just 11 years earlier, and the Portuguese took Goa from India. But Okinawans felt little gratitude. Perry's instructions for convincing the regent to sign an agreement laid power on the line. "Let the mayor clearly understand that this port of Naha is to be one of rendezvous, probably for years, and that the authorities had better come to an understanding at once. Persistence in trying to sustain their own laws and customs, which they have no power to enforce, would surely involve themselves in trouble." The Commodore used the same tone when threatening to occupy Shuri with his Marines. "It is repugnant to the American character to submit to such a course of inhospitable discourtesy," he said, referring to the resistance to his landing. His double talk had a 20th century ring. "Americans," he added, "are always regardful of and obedient to the laws of the countries in which they may happen to be." Such rot rested on implied racial superiority, as if Okinawans hadn't had enough of it from Japan. Before his final departure, Perry demanded a treaty stipulating that Okinawans must in the future service American ships and citizens with great courtesy and friendship. A preamble stated that the servants were signing voluntarily. When they refused, the Marines were again sent ashore to force them. Meanwhile, a party had planted the Stars and Stripes on an Okinawan pinnacle they named Banner Rock, as if Americans had discovered the island.